Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. We've now heard more information about the AI Safety Summit, which the UK's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has called for the 1st and 2nd of November to be held at the historic site of Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire, a bit outside London. That summit is a great opportunity, not only for political posturing and people having their photographs taken on the world stage and hopefully for them reflecting well with voters, but also frankly for some very serious discussions that ideally will transcend some of the tropes and simple-minded analysis of the future. Yesterday, it was announced that there were 5 themes for this AI Safety Summit, and I have to say, I like these themes. 1, to develop a shared understanding of the risks posed by frontier AI. That's the term for next-generation large language models and other systems that might be built with them, and the need for action. 2nd, a forward process for international collaboration on frontier AI safety, including how best to support national and international frameworks. 3rd, appropriate measures which individual organisations should take to increase frontier AI safety. In other words, what organisations should be doing by themselves without necessarily waiting for international agreements to come in place. 4th, areas for potential collaboration on AI safety research, including evaluating model capabilities and the development of new standards to support governance. And 5th, something I see as very important, showcasing how ensuring the safe development of AI will enable AI to be used for good globally. In other words, it's not just words, but pointing to some early examples of how various processes, standards, development methods are already helping AI to avoid risks and be used for good. So that's part of what's on my mind. And I think it's a good opportunity for Calum and myself to reflect on what we think should be in the minds of policymakers, both those who will be in attendance and those who will be advising the global leaders. So Calum, bring us up to date on some of what you're thinking about in terms of the scenarios for the future of AI.
Those points from the summit all sound very unobjectionable. And I think that is a key word, unobjectionable. It's often worth testing declarations by thinking about what their opposites might mean. And those aspirations that the government has outlined, you couldn't agree with any of their opposites. So that renders them a little bit vapid. But they're all perfectly good. They're a bit motherhood and apple pie, but they're perfectly good. They're also very ungranular. They don't split out what the risks and opportunities of AI are because they're very, very varied. And one of the things that I feel strongly about is most people who don't spend their time thinking about AI, or most of their time thinking about it, get confused about the different risks and possibilities that will happen at different times. So in the short term, with generative AI and with deep learning, we have risks like privacy, bias, and transparency, and we have opportunities like tremendous improvements in productivity and great products and services. In the very long term, and that actually might only be a couple of decades, or it might be longer, we have the possibility of superintelligence, and that gives rise to opportunities and risks which are very different. And those are all jumbled up in the public's mind. The risk of superintelligence, like possible extinction or possible almost godhood, godlike capabilities for humans, gets all jumbled up in the public mind with the nearer term opportunities and risks. And I think that's unfortunate. And these aspirations do nothing to unscramble that. But perhaps that can happen at the summit. The thing I've been returning to, because it's a long-standing theme lately, is the possibility of joblessness, which I see as fitting in the middle of the timeline. So it's not happening today. It's not going to happen tomorrow. And if it does happen, it will happen considerably before superintelligence arrives. And the idea is that machines will get good enough so that they can replace almost everything that we can do for money. As you know, David, I've written a book about this called The Economic Singularity, and I'm releasing a video on it, a video called The Misconceptions about Joblessness. So I think it'd be worth diving into that because we've never actually allocated an episode to that subject.
The misunderstandings about joblessness, what are they?
I think there's 2 big ones. And I think the first one is the idea that machines can never replace humans in almost all jobs, that machines can never cause lasting widespread technological unemployment. And this is a very common misconception. There's people who will argue it forcefully. And it's very understandable because there's good reasons for believing it. And the reasons for believing it are that it's never happened in the past. We've had automation for centuries. And what has always happened in the long run with any episode of automation is that people lost their jobs, but they got better jobs. And the transition could be very difficult. In fact, for some people, it could be downright devastating. But whether you're thinking about lift operators, secretaries in most offices, and the great majority of people working on farms, all those people who were doing those jobs and their descendants are now doing other jobs. And generally speaking, they're better paid, more interesting and safer jobs. So in the past, automation has actually created efficiency, and efficiency creates wealth, wealth creates demand, and demand creates new jobs, including new jobs for humans. So it's perfectly reasonable to say, well, that's always happened in the past. Why won't it always continue to happen in the future? But there's two reasons to think that it won't. One is that if you think about another species, there has been lasting widespread technological unemployment, and that species is the horse. In 1915, there were 21.5 million horses working in America, and they were mostly pulling vehicles around on roads and in farms. And the horse population of America today is about 2 million. That is really severe, widespread, lasting technological unemployment. It happened because horses only had one capability to offer. They had their muscle power. And it hasn't happened to humans because we are different in that we have other capabilities to offer. Humans did get automated out of muscle jobs. Lots of people used to push plows around on farms, and almost nobody does that now. Instead, the people who are doing those muscle jobs on farms are now working in shops and offices around the world. So the technological unemployment that did strike horses hasn't struck humans. It will.
It is interesting. There were discussions in the late 19th century as to whether horses would, in the end, be made unemployed, because there had been displacement of horses from some modes of transport with the steam engine, with the paddle boat, but actually more horses had got more jobs because you needed transport to the railways. You needed transport to the steamships. And so the population of working horses was mushrooming. And a few crazy futurists said, well, eventually the vehicles, the horseless carriages, will get better. And there were four strong arguments against it. One, that these horseless carriages would be too heavy. They would damage the roadways. Second, they were too noisy. Who would put up with such noisy devices? Third, they emitted foul-smelling smoke. Nobody would put up with that. And fourth, they were a fire hazard. They were emitting sparks all over the place. And so there were clever people who were convinced that horses had an indefinitely long future ahead of them. And then horseless vehicles got better and better, with people like Henry Ford, who discovered how to make them cheaply and how to make them safely, less heavily, more dependably, less smellily, and without fire hazards. And as we know, things changed quite quickly. There's two famous photographs of Easter parades in New York, one around 1903, which is dominated by horses and with one out-of-place horseless carriage lurking in the distance. Whereas if you move forward about 10 years, another famous photograph of the same place has exactly the reverse, which people would not have predicted as happening so quickly. So I think that historical example is illuminating in more ways.
Absolutely. The speed that it happened was really quite remarkable. I think it was about 13 years to go from almost all horse-drawn vehicles in New York City to almost all horseless vehicles in New York City. The same thing will happen to humans at some point if we continue to keep improving the capabilities of machines, because unless there's a hard stop in the improvement of the capabilities of machines, they will at some point get more capable than us in every line of work that we can make money at. They'll do each of the jobs cheaper, better, and faster than we can. And so they will render us unemployable. What we don't know, of course, is when, and we don't know how quickly, and we don't know how the process will develop. I think the process will happen very quickly. I think that As long as there are more than just a tiny number of jobs, which machines can't yet do, there'll be plenty of work for humans because demand, as a lot of economists point out, tends to be inelastic. And so even if there's only 5 significant jobs left, there'll be jobs for most humans doing just those 5 jobs. But then those 5 jobs will go. And at that point, boom, there's no more jobs for humans. So I think there's going to be like a phase change. We'll see it coming, but there'll be lots of jobs. And then suddenly one day there won't be jobs for humans. And it'll probably happen over the period of certainly less than a year, quite possibly within a month or so. And I think we need to be prepared for it.
And that quick timescale is one of the reasons you use the word singularity. It's something that might come up unexpectedly quickly.
Yeah. I use the word singularity actually just to mean the biggest possible change that can happen, something that's bigger than a revolution. It's just sort of a massive change, a really fundamental change. So that's the first misconception, that machines can't cause lasting widespread technological unemployment. Understandable, but wrong, I think. And then the second misconception is that the problem with technological unemployment for humans is meaning, that we wouldn't know what to do with ourselves. And I think this is also seriously wrong. I think the problem is actually money. The problem is how we get resources to everybody who's not got a job to live a really good, fulfilling life. Now, when most people take the idea of technological unemployment seriously for the first time, they think, oh, I wouldn't know what to do without my job. I wouldn't know where to find fulfillment or meaning in my life. And I think that's wrong on a number of levels. One is that for most people, jobs don't provide meaning. They provide food for the family. They provide some structure and they may provide some status, but they don't really provide meaning. For most people, meaning is provided by family, friends, religious and other beliefs, passions and interests and cultural appreciations. There are a small number of people who do find meaning in their jobs. They get most of the meaning in their lives from their jobs. And there's a bit of a problem that those tend to be the people who discuss technological unemployment because it leads them astray to think that's true for everybody. But there's lots of evidence that most people don't find meaning in their jobs. So I don't think that the absence of a job is going to take meaning out of our lives. And there are also 3 categories of humans who I think demonstrate this very clearly. One is aristocrats who for centuries have largely not had jobs. And there isn't a massive tidal wave of existential despair among aristocrats. They live some of the best lives, most entertaining and fun lives that have ever been lived. The second group is comfortably off retired people. I know quite a lot of them because of the age I'm at. They do not want another job. They're very happy living the lives they live and they don't suffer from a lack of meaning. And then the third group is children. I have never met a child who said, I need a job to give me some meaning in life. Children are brilliant at finding meaning in the most trivial things, in ordering the pebbles on a beach. So I firmly believe that we will all find meaning in our lives. Most people don't find they've got an absence of meaning when they go on holiday. And most people would be very happy to extend their holidays and have more of them.
So what is the problem, Calum?
I think the real problem, as I said, is resources. We need to provide everybody around the world in a post-jobs world with enough resources to have a really good life. And I mean, for instance, a good, solid, middle-class American quality of life. You could argue that we should be using less resources than a middle-class American uses right now, and that's going to happen anyway. But that sort of quality of life. We mustn't have a world in which there's a few people who are thunderingly rich and everybody else is struggling to survive. That's unsustainable. It's wrong. And I think it would lead to social collapse sooner or later. So how do we do this redistribution? It's a very hard problem. A lot of people think the answer is simple. It's called universal basic income. And people have done calculations to show that you could, by increasing the tax on financial transactions a little bit, you could suddenly create a huge pool of wealth which could be distributed to everybody in the world. I think that's just wrong. I think the numbers are inaccurate. And I think the best you could do is provide a very, very low level of income to most people. And that's not good enough. The little word in the middle of the phrase, basic, gives the game away. We need to do more than create a basic income. We need to create a generous income for everybody. I think that the solution lies in the general concept of abundance, which is the idea that technological progress reduces the cost of all goods and services down to close to zero. Not all the way to zero, because we want to retain the market. The market is a terrific mechanism for allocating scarce resources, and there will always be scarce resources. So we want to retain the market, but we want to get the price of goods and services down so low that the redistribution, which is almost certainly going to have to go on from people who've got assets and people who've still got income to everybody else, make that not a burdensome process. So I think that's the key, but there's an awful lot of devil in the detail of it, and we really ought to get working on it, because this could happen within a small number of decades. And if it comes upon us as a surprise and we haven't done the preparatory work, it could be disastrous. I think the upsides of technological unemployment could be magnificent. A world in which all of humanity was freed from being wage slaves is a world where we just do what we want to do. And we could have a second renaissance. We could all spend our time learning and playing and having fun and exploring. Some of us will spend much of the time getting drunk, and I imagine most of us will get past that and get over it. But I think people will have a great time as long as we can solve this resource problem. If we don't solve the resource problem, then the future is very bleak, because, as Yuval Harari memorably put it, a future of the gods and the useless. And that's a really bad scenario.
So you're advocating not a UBI, but a UGI, a universal generous income. And what makes that possible, if I've got this right, is driving down the costs of all the key goods and services. So government shouldn't be patting their backs when they see GDP going up, but patting their backs when the costs for education, food, security, entertainment, healthcare is measurably coming down. So how are we going to get to that outcome, Calum?
I think we're going to go much of the way there without even trying. So there are three things which are driving prices down. One is automation, because when you automate a process, you remove the humans from that process. And humans are very often the most expensive part of any process, any economic activity. So automation does that for us. The second element is improving efficiency. And AI is accelerating what's already been happening for a very long time, which is the improvement of the efficiency of most production processes, both products and services. And then the third element is reducing energy costs. I think it's not well understood how quickly we are moving to a post-fossil fuel energy environment. The spread of solar and wind and other renewable energy sources is happening actually very quickly. And as it happens, the cost of energy, it seems odd now at a time when energy prices are so high, but as it happens, the cost of energy will plummet. I live in a house where we have solar cells powering a heat pump, and we've got our energy costs really low. And most houses will be like that. Energy costs will get so low that eventually they're likely to be too cheap to meter for many applications. So with this trinity of automation removing humans from the process, AI improving the efficiency of the process, and the move to renewables reducing the energy input costs of the process, I think we can achieve abundance. What we have to do is to figure out what rate that can happen at and how we do the distribution of the remaining assets that need to be redistributed to provide the generous income for everybody.
So you do have in mind some socialist-style redistribution of wealth from the particularly successful companies, the owners of the means of automation, to everybody?
Actually, I don't know whether it would be socialist. That's a possible future. Another possible future is that you have like a twin track economy, or even two separate economies. So you have one economy in which everybody spends resources which they're allocated. So a government or some centralized authority provides the resources, and you spend them on goods and services which are very, very close to free. But there's another economy in which goods and services are traded, which are luxury goods and services. So, for instance, original paintings, original cars, the best beach house in the best beach in the world, and so on. These things are traded at a market rate, and people can make fortunes and get taxed on that activity in order to pay for the operation of the other economy. That's another way of doing it. Now, I don't profess to have the answers to this. I think we need a lot of smart people working on how this works.
So do you think the meeting in Bletchley Park on AI safety, which is looking at upsides too and how to achieve the upsides, should they be allocating time to the economic singularity part of the future rather than just the things they've currently spoken about as being on the agenda?
I wish they would. I'm very sceptical they will, but I wish they would.
Aren't there connections between the different risks? Because if people perceive that they are missing out, if people perceive that they can no longer get the kind of jobs that they had expected historically, generation after generation, fathers were quite proud that their sons were earning more than them, and daughters as well. But increasingly, in some parts of the world, not everywhere, there's a perception of lack of economic mobility. It's harder for people who are displaced from one set of jobs to relocate, to reskill, to re-identify and get the new jobs. And more people are upset. And you've talked, I think, Calum, about, is it the big crunch? Maybe that's the wrong word.
I talk about the great churn. I see the great churn as being the accelerated rate of change of jobs. So I've said that I think there will be jobs for most people right up until the point where the phase change happens and there are fairly suddenly almost no jobs for humans. But I think during that process, that phase change process, as we're building the pressure up before the change, I think people will have to change jobs and change careers and change industries more and more frequently. So that's what I mean by a big churn.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
The People in Performance podcast offers insights into the strategic competencies, behaviors, and results needed to increase the performance of employees and leaders. The show looks at all areas of the world of work, including attraction and recruitment, onboarding, training, and succession planning. Tune in to get a better handle on the stages of workforce planning you need to master in order to guarantee long-term success in a rapidly changing world of work. New episodes drop each week. Check out the latest People in Performance episodes on your podcast platform of choice. Follow us on socials and read the latest articles at pppod.com.
And if people aren't prepared for it, they may end up falling into the laps of populists, demagogues, or other disruptive movements. And instead of cooperating for the accomplishment of this abundance economy with UGI, they will be fighting against what they see as change and stirring up the revolutions of the wrong kind.
Absolutely right. In fact, I think that populism is actually our biggest problem. I think we're going to go towards abundance even without trying, as I've said. I think we need to work out how the distribution process works. I like your phrase of UGI. I think that's very good. I think we need to do some planning for that, but I suspect it could evolve pretty much on its own. I think our biggest risk is that we screw it up by voting for really, really bad politicians. We've done that recently. I think Donald Trump is one of the worst politicians ever to walk the earth. I think Boris Johnson is a terrible human being and a terrible politician and has done great damage to the UK. And if we have a world where most people fear that they are about to lose their income and it'll be not replaced, then people will vote for even worse politicians. So I think we could really make a mess of society by making really bad political choices. So we have to avoid doing that. Is it true that younger people today face a worse future than their parents? I'm absolutely not convinced of that. I think there's all sorts of interesting evidence in all sorts of different directions. It's a fundamental problem that GDP is a bad indicator of wealth in a broad sense. And that wouldn't surprise the creator of the measure because he didn't expect it to have a life as long as it's had. And it's got some well-known flaws in it. It doesn't capture a lot of the genuine creation of wealth. And famously, it doesn't capture the productivity improvements from computers. You and I, David, started working before computers were widespread in organizations. And I know that I am enormously more productive thanks to the arrival of computers, but you can't see it in GDP figures. Similarly, I think you look at the lives of young people today, they may not be able to buy a house so easily, but their standard of life, and many of them wouldn't like to hear this, but their standard of life is far better than the standard of life that we had at their age. They eat better, they travel much, much more. Their access to information is immeasurably better. Their access to entertainment is immeasurably better, and lots of other ways. Most products work much better than they used to. When I was a kid, cars broke down all the time. They leaked oil all the time, made a horrible noise, and they did, like 3 miles to the gallon. And now you can drive from one end of Europe to the other or one end of America to the other, and you can pretty much rely on a car to get you there in one piece without breaking down. And that's true of most goods that people use every day. But these things are not captured in GDP. So I'm not at all convinced that the future is worse than the past.
So it depends on us winning the narrative, clarifying that there's a different way of looking at things in which people should see a great opportunity ahead. And it may not involve them working 40 hours a week, but they don't need to work 40 hours a week. They don't need to have a higher headline salary than their parents did. They can have a very good life without such a large headline salary.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I know that a lot of people will accuse me of being a wild techno-optimist and ridiculously naive, but this is based on many decades of experience. And the way I look at the world is I think that by and large, things are getting better. And things are getting better because of technology. I firmly believe this is the best time ever to have been a human being for the great majority of people. And I think that a generation hence, it will be even better thanks to technology.
So we've spoken about some politicians we don't particularly like. We have said that there isn't a lot of good guidance about how to achieve this future economy of abundance and universal generous income. But are there any positive examples, maybe partial positive examples you can highlight to give our listeners some hint that we're not just imagining an impossible future?
Well, I'm loath to name any politicians who I think are offering great hope, partly because the moment you do that, they then go and do something disastrous and it all looks very silly. But I am heartened by the fact that politicians are now talking about AI and about the future in a way that they weren't just a few months ago. And I think GPT-4 has really brought this about. And I think Sam Altman deserves a great deal of credit for kickstarting this conversation. I hear now politicians using phrases like existential risk from AI. That would have been unthinkable last year. There's no way that could have happened. So the debate is happening. I think that's a very good start.
And I believe that when Sam Altman testified in an audience of US politicians, some of normal politics was briefly suspended. Normally, when they have expert witnesses, the two different sides of US politics like to poke fun at each other's remarks and saying, well, that stupid politician from the other side has just made an incredibly partisan remark. Here I am offering a much more sensible remark. Whereas on this occasion, there was a perception there was something bigger at foot. And they were, despite their normal inclinations, they were actually complimenting each other across the aisle for having advanced the conversation. So there may be some hope there too.
Yeah, that was a remarkable episode. It was a bit like when the Brits and the Germans played football at Christmas during World War I. Maybe it's because they all knew that they were completely out of their depth and they were talking to a young man who knew infinitely more than they did about the issue. And they decided to stop throwing brickbats at each other and listen for a change, which was very encouraging.
So I guess politicians are like most of us, which is we can sometimes be on bad behaviour and sometimes we can be on better behaviour. And they may have mixed motivations for getting involved in these conversations. They may say, well, they have to do it because political reality demands it. But when they get involved in these conversations, at least for some of them, the substance of the argument will dwell in their minds, and if not their minds, then their advisors' minds, at least in some cases. And in such a case, they'll be looking around for real answers, something more substantial. And I guess that's where you and I, Calum, and the rest of the Futurist community needs to be ready, so that when the phone call comes, the Zoom invite appears, when the invitation to the AI Safety Summit finally arrives, they seem to have been a bit delayed in the post, at least mine has, then we are ready to appear and to speak engagedly, candidly, but also crisply and clearly to offer them something that is meaningful to them.
That's right. And I think given my comments about the government of the UK, I don't think my invitation's even got into the post. I think also there's something kind of before that, which is politicians sometimes lead public opinion, but generally they follow it, or they can't get too far ahead of it anyway. They have to be reactive to their voting public. What we need to have is many more people thinking seriously about the problems and the opportunities that AI and other future technologies raise, and demanding from their politicians that they take these issues seriously. That's really where I see what we're doing, David, you and I, is trying to help improve the standard of conversation about AI.
I can also invite listeners to have a look at a survey I have recently released. It's phase 2 of an ongoing set of surveys about future scenarios for AI. There are 16 questions in there, trying to prompt people not just to offer an opinion, but to explain their opinions and also to read the answers that previous participants have given. So question 1 is, for example, how much change are we likely to see between now and 2030? Question 2 explores the notion of emergence. Question 3 looks at the circumstances in which we might have AI, superintelligence, leading towards superbenevolence. And so on it goes. So I encourage listeners to keep listening to our episodes, but if you're willing to engage in a different part of the argument, then look up that survey as well.
And I highly recommend it.
Thanks very much. Looking forward to coming back to this subject as more news becomes clear as to the AI Safety Summit in the UK and corresponding initiatives around the world. Thanks, Calum.
Thanks, David.